So welcome everybody to EduPlanet 21's 10-Minute Tuesdays. These are conversations with experts in education. My name is Claire Coop-Scott, and I am responsible for marketing and professional learning at EduPlanet. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by the newly crowned Dr. JT Taylor from Purpose Pictures. Thanks so much, JT, for joining me today.
Absolutely, Claire. It is a pleasure to be with you.
So one of the things, JT, you and I have spoken many times that I love your social media. I follow you on Twitter and LinkedIn, and I think you're very insightful. And so today I kind of want to focus a little bit on curriculum. I noticed a tweet in January of this year that said, number one, it was out to educational leaders. Number one, don't assume that all teachers understand how to align curriculum, instruction, and assessments. Number two, don't assume that all teachers have the capacity to make an aligned lesson culturally responsive. And number three, provide PD on number one and number two. And, since EduPlanet is a curriculum management platform supported by professional learning, I thought this was a pretty great tweet. So if it's okay with you, that's what I'd like to focus a little bit on today.
Outstanding. I would love to delve a little bit deeper into that tweet.
All right. So let's start with number one. Talk to me about alignment. How would you define curriculum alignment with instruction and assessment?
So anytime you're engaging in teaching and learning, there has to be some type of expectation, some type of curriculum that we're going to use. So the question is, what do we want students to learn? And what we want students to learn, that's what we're focused on teaching. Nothing more, nothing less. We want to make sure that whatever we have determined in terms of skills, concepts, knowledge, information that we want students to gain, that's what we want to focus on. So when we talk about aligning the curriculum, we're talking about aligning what's written, the written curriculum, whatever standards have already been determined, whatever skills have already been determined that students need to achieve a level of mastery in. We want to align that written curriculum with the actual teaching and the instructional component. And so when we're talking about alignment, we're talking about taking that written curriculum and making sure we teach according to the written curriculum. So when we do not align the curriculum, that's where all of the problems pop up in education. You might have a teacher who has a written curriculum. Let's use science, for example. There may be science standards, science skills, investigations that students need to engage in, concepts that students need to learn. Well, we need to align that curriculum with our actual teaching practices. When we fail to align that curriculum, we teach a lesson that is not aligned. And anytime you teach a lesson that's not aligned, when it comes to testing those students, when it comes to assessing those students, they will never demonstrate mastery. They'll never demonstrate proficiency because we spent so much time teaching things that they're never going to be assessed on. And that's the biggest issue in education is aligning curriculum, instruction, and assessment.
Right. And as I think JT, part of EduPlanet's platform with the curriculum is that's exactly what our educators do. They go in and start with what do we want our students to learn? What is the end? And then they can look at their assessments, and then they can look at their, their learning activities. And, we have a great feature in the platform that says, did I align this? And it will show them where they did. Did I say I wanted them to learn this and I didn't test for it? Or did I test for it, but I never taught it? So
absolutely,
that's something that is built, baked right into the platform.
And that makes EduPlanet, it's PD times 2. Because in one sense, just the way the platform is constructed to keep the educator's mind focused on alignment and reflection, because now you can actually see, did I align the written with the taught? And did I actually assess what I taught based on what the curriculum is stated? So it keeps people actually focused on alignment of the curriculum, which means they're getting 2 types of PD, whether they're conscious of it or not, which is perfect.
So talk to me a little bit about number 2 in that tweet, which was that lessons need to be culturally responsive. What does that mean? That seems like a big ask. So what does it mean, and how do we do that?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, culturally responsive teaching. This approach to teaching and learning, it stems from the great work of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, Dr. Geneva Gay, and a lot of people have read Zaretta Hammond's book, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. And so this is an approach. Let's first start with that. It's not a strategy, it's an approach. It's a pedagogical posture. It's a way of doing education. And so when you focus on being culturally responsive, the number one thing that you're doing is you're viewing students' culture as an instructional asset. You're viewing students' culture as an instructional tool. So I like to coach educators and explain that the greatest tool you'll ever have to teach a child is knowledge about that child. So at a baseline, before we even think about teaching that child the curriculum, we need to ask ourselves, what do we know about these students? What are the students' interests, needs? What piques their interest? What's going to get them engaged before we even handle the curriculum? So that's what you're doing when you're trying to make a lesson culturally responsive. You can design a lesson that's not for particular students. But once you recognize that I designed a generic lesson, now my goal is to make this lesson come alive for that student who may not be in love with science or reading or math or social studies or what have you. So I have to think, what is going to make this student connect with the content? The best way to do that is to make sure that their lesson is responsive to the student's culture. For example, if you have a student who loves soccer, baseball, football, or any type of sport, you want to introduce math, reading, science, utilizing sports, because that's knowledge that child already has. So that child can easily connect to the concept, whatever we're teaching, because they have knowledge from the culture in which that student is bringing into the class. So we're utilizing the student's culture as an asset. So anytime you're trying to align a lesson and make it culturally responsive, you first need to know who the student is, what is the student's cultural background, what are the student's interests, needs, likes, passions, things of that nature, and then making sure that your curriculum actually reflects and mirrors the things that the student values. And so we're seeing the student's culture as an asset and not a liability. And that's difficult for a lot of educators, because typically when an educator creates a lesson plan, they're creating a lesson plan for all of the students. They're not thinking about that one student who might not embrace math as readily as the other students, because some students are going to come in, they're passionate about math, they're passionate about science. So it really doesn't matter what lesson you create. They're like, woohoo, give me more. I love this stuff automatically. But then you have some students, they don't love math. So you have to literally make them love math by showing them how math relates to their lived experience. Dr. Christopher Emdin, he calls it reality pedagogy. So you got to take the curriculum and make it apply to the students' lived experiences and lived reality. That's when learning comes alive for all children.
So I was going to ask you for an example. You gave me one, but I'm wondering if you could talk about maybe a teacher or a classroom where you've seen this come to life and where you saw a change, because I know you're working with teachers all the time. So I'd love to hear a story from you.
Absolutely. And so I think for a lot of young people, American culture, we love sports. So I think sports is already a cultural bridge for a lot of students. Especially when you're talking about like a math class, because to be honest, the number one opposition to like culturally responsive approaches is usually a math teacher, because they're like, Dr. Taylor, well, math is culturally neutral. It's just numbers. And I'm like, yes, while math might appear to be culturally neutral, the instructor, the educator who's presenting math is not culturally neutral. Every time teaching takes place, we're always pulling from our own culture. We're using references, we're using examples, just like the analogy that I use about sports. That's because I love sports. So it's easy for me to apply my knowledge of basketball and percentages or baseball and statistics in a math context, because I see how baseball applies to math because I'm from a sports culture as well. But that might not apply to someone who's not infatuated with sports culture. So from an educator, you got to think, what makes this person tick? For example, when we use references on worksheets, let's say we have a math worksheet and it has oranges and apples in elementary class. Like, count these apples, count these oranges, something so generic. But what about that young person who loves airplanes? So we're talking about using references and examples that the students connect with to help us teach the concepts. So in science, in reading, in social studies, is really about taking information that you have about that student and using that information, using that student's cultural background and lived experience to be an instructional asset when you're trying to communicate or teach a particular lesson.
I also think it comes down to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, even, when we're thinking about performance tasks or how students are going to show us that they know something, that we don't have to direct them exactly in let them pick something that's of interest to them to show us that they understand the concepts. We have to get away from always being the one to say, this is how you're going to show it to me.
Oh, you're on it, Claire. You're on it. And so, like, here's the 3 core tenets of culturally responsive teaching, according to Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. The number one is academic achievement. So you have to focus on helping students achieve a level of mastery and proficiency. You want to tap into the intellectual treasure that the child already has. The number 2 core tenet is what you're referring to, and it is affirmation of students' cultural competence. So what that means is I'm assuming that my students are brilliant and not the opposite. I'm not assuming that students don't know how to do it or don't have the capacity to engage in a particular lesson. I'm bringing this assumption of brilliance to the table so that it gives me the freedom to say, oh, I'm going to just let you see what you can do. I'm just going to give you the autonomy and the freedom to show me what you know, opposed to thinking this student may struggle or they need extra scaffolds and different things. Whereas to your point, if we just give the students a task, a project-based assessment, and allow them to play with it, we'll learn a lot in terms of what they're able to do and what supports they might need. But that's on the educator to feel as if you have the freedom to just allow children to display their brilliance in whatever way they choose. And so I see this a lot, especially in a lot of the school districts that I work with, like poetry. Poetry is a tremendous tool, can be used in every core content by allowing students to express themselves in rhyme scheme. That can be done in math, that can be done in science, that can be done in social studies. But if students are infatuated with rhyme scheme or particular students identify with hip hop culture, it'd be great to allow them to share their responses in that way. But you have to validate students' intelligence and give them the opportunity to show how brilliant they are. But that's on the educator.
As a child, I always struggled with social studies, and I always thought that if it was all written to song, I would really get it because I would remember it.
That's exactly what we're talking about, Claire. So for you, if you love song, then the teacher should validate that and say, oh, you know what? Instead of asking Claire to write a 5-sentence paragraph, I'm going to ask Claire or give her the permission to write it in song. And I guarantee, because that's something that you're interested in, that's a culture that you validate, you appreciate, you're going to be more likely to do that. I often encourage teachers, if you haven't used Roblox, Minecraft in your classroom yet to help students grasp concepts, you're doing students a disservice, because these students today, they're a gaming generation. So games should be used to help students learn and engage in the content in the curriculum as well.
Great. So one of the things I believe you know about the platform is, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, is that, in stage 1, the educators are selecting what standards. So whether those are science standards or social studies standards, but there's also a spot where we have what we call other goals or other standards. And these are things that schools can use that might be national, whether those are the habits of mind or the CASEL social emotional learning framework items. But also we have districts who put in like their profile of a graduate. So they are selecting those items when they are developing all of their units and lessons to make sure that they are covering. Is there anything that they could be thinking about including when it comes to being culturally responsive, so that they could ensure that that is a lens through which they're developing their curriculum?
Absolutely. So I went over the number one component, which was student academic achievement. Number two component was affirmation of students' cultural competence. And then the third, which I feel like is the most important because it's outcome driven. It is, and it's a lot of $5 words in this one, but it is the facilitation of socio-political critical consciousness. And although it's all of these buzzwords, all it means is critical thinking. And so I know across the country, and particularly in the state of Virginia, where I'm located, we have a Virginia profile of a graduate as well. And one of the, we call them the 5 C's. One of those C's is critical thinking. I think every educator and every school and district should be focused and driven toward helping students develop critical thinking, so that students are not just, led astray by misinformation, that students can critique the lessons that they're learning, critique institutions in society. That's a critical lens that needs to be developed. And so clearly comprehension skills and critical thinking, they go hand in hand. But I think one thing that we can do to ensure that teachers are focused on developing students in the area of culturally responsiveness is helping students develop those critical thinking questions, so that students can critique policies and practices that might be harmful to them in their particular community. So I give you one example. In the state of Virginia, in the Hampton Roads region, there's a city that is directly located in a food desert. And so a food desert just means that those students don't have a lot of access to whole foods and nutritious foods. And so they don't have access to a lot of whole food marketplaces. So that might be linked to why that particular city has medical issues, or lower or lower longevity or higher mortality rate. And so the students might not understand how lack of access to whole foods and nutritious vegetables and fruits, how that might impact their ability to live life and enjoy life, and the sustainability of life. So that's something that a teacher can talk about in science, can talk about in English, can talk about in math, and connect it to and help students develop critical thinking skills, so that the students might say, hey, why don't we have access to this type of quality food in our area? And that's when you say, okay, well, now when you go to social studies, you need to learn who you need to contact, what congresswoman or man, what, political individual who you might need to contact to help address those issues that might be harmful to your particular community. But a student will never have that critical lens if we don't teach them to be culturally responsive. So I think, to summarize it, it's just really a focus on critical thinking, so that students can learn how to critique different things that might be harmful to them in their community.
Terrific. So I know we're running up against our 10 minutes. We probably have gone over. JT, I think you and I probably do a lot.
I'm long-winded, Claire. Forgive me, everyone.
So in the institute that you've developed on rebuilding for equity and inclusion, I know you do touch on culturally responsive teaching, although that's a huge topic. So it's certainly not the be all and the end all of culturally responsive professional learning. But I would love you to kind of talk a little bit about number 3 in your tweet, which was provide professional learning to your teachers on both curriculum alignment as well as culturally responsive teaching. Can you kind of talk about how and why it's important to marry those two?
Absolutely. So when you look at rebuilding for equity and inclusion, anytime you're rebuilding something, you need a blueprint. No contractor, no engineer, no builder just hops out there and starts constructing something. And so for me, it always starts with what I like to deem a compelling vision. And for me, educators need to have a vision for reaching, inspiring, and educating all children. at the highest level possible. And so if that's your vision to increase the academic performance, the academic achievement of each child in a particular school or district, then you need to have a vision for accomplishing that. You need to have a blueprint, a tangible plan that says, here's our goals, here's our expectations, here's the outcomes we want, and here's how we're going to do it. So that's where our course comes directly into the forefront, because you need to rebuild for equity. You know, equity is ensuring that every child has what they need to actually thrive. So you need to start with a plan to rebuild. And once you start mapping out a plan, you're going to realize that some students don't have access to the same resources as other students. And some students don't have access to culturally responsive materials in the classroom. So that's where the culturally responsiveness has to come into the play, where you start considering groups of students and saying, man, I wonder if this group of students lacks culturally relevant materials. I wonder how many books are in the libraries in these particular schools where students see authors who actually look like them, authors who they can identify with, authors who come from the same cultural background and lived experience as the students. And so that's why it's important to rebuild for equity and inclusion, because you want to ensure that every child feels included. No child should walk around the schoolhouse feeling as if they're anonymous, like no one knows them and they don't feel a sense of belonging. So if we're going to rebuild for equity and inclusion, it's going to move you towards being culturally responsive and making sure that you respond to each of the individual students.
Fantastic. So JT, I can always sit and talk with you for hours on end. I feel like we always have great conversation. But what I'll do is make sure that we include information about your institute in the notes for this video. I really appreciate the conversation, and I know it won't be the last one. So thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Claire. I appreciate the work that you do.